In this video, we're going to talk about white blood cells. This is Chapter 19, Part 4. So white blood cells and red blood cells are actually quite different. So white blood cells, remember these are also called leukocytes. These have a nuclei and they have a full complement of other organelles, but these do not contain any hemoglobin. White blood cells are classified as either granular or agranular, and this depends on whether they contain this chemical-filled cytoplasmic vesicles or granules, and these are made visible when you stain them and you look at them through a light microscope. So granular leukocytes, these include neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. And agranular leukocytes are lymphocytes and monocytes. So here we have the three types of granular leukocytes. Now after staining, each of these three different types of granular leukocytes displays these differently colored granules, and they can be kind of distinctly recognized under a microscope. So first off, we have these neutrophils. And the granules in neutrophils are actually quite smaller than those of the other granular leukocytes. You can kind of see them here. They're going to be evenly distributed throughout the whole cell, and they're going to be a very pale purple color. Now these particular granules, they don't strongly interact with either the very red acidic stain or with the very blue basic stain. So that's why these white blood cells are neutrophilic. So they're neutral loving. They don't love the acidic stain and they don't love the basic stain. Couple different things about neutrophils is that neutrophils have a nucleus that has like 2 to 3 lobes. They're all still connected, but they're kind of different lobes here. Can kind of see that, and these are connected by these strands of nuclear material between them. Next, we have eosinophils. Now these have very kind of large but very uniformly sized granules. You can see these here, and they are eosin loving. So eosin is kind of a pinkish stain, and so because of this they stain kind of a red orange or like a pinkish color, and so this is a very acidic dye, but eosin, the stain, which is eosin, is going to be pretty pink. Sometimes it's red or orange colored is what it's described as. Now these granules in eosinophils, they usually don't cover the nucleus. You can see the nucleus here, which is this large 2-lobed nucleus. And then you have all the granules, which are over here. So they don't really obscure the nucleus at all there. Next, we have basophils. So eosinophils, these are attracted to acidic dyes. And basophils are going to be basic loving. So they're going to really be attracted to basic stains, or the granules are going to be attracted to basic stains. So these granules are pretty round, but they're not uniform in size. You can even see like right here, there's quite a few different sized granules, and they usually stain pretty dark purple blue, and that's because of this basic dye is going to be very dark in color. Now, often, unlike the other two, these granules often obscure the nucleus, and the nucleus does have 2 lobes. Often you can't see it very well because of the granules, because the granules obscure it so much, but these nuclei do have 2 lobes. So here we have those agranular leukocytes. So they do have some cytoplasmic granules, but often these granules are not visible under a light microscope. And this is because the granules are so small in size and because they don't stain very well. They just don't pick up the stain like those granular leukocytes do. So first we have lymphocytes. So the nucleus of the lymphocyte stains really dark. So you can see this nucleus here is stained quite dark here. And it usually is like kind of pretty round, but also kind of sometimes slightly indented, as you can see there. Now the cytoplasm stains a very light blue or a sky blue, and it forms this small ring around the nucleus. The nucleus kind of takes up most of the cell. And then we have monocytes. These have nuclei that are kind of like kidney-shaped or horseshoe-shaped. They kind of have quite a distinct shape there. And then the cytoplasm around it stains almost a blue-gray, a very light color, so it's very distinctive with that dark nucleus. So for monocytes, they're actually a really important cell that travels through the blood, and it's actually going to be able to migrate from the blood into the tissues. And when they migrate, they're actually going to differentiate and fully develop into macrophages. And when they're fully developed into macrophages, this is when they can work as an engulfing cell, and they are able to engulf cell debris or dead cells or foreign particles or viruses, that kind of stuff as well. So they're really good white blood cells to have around. So remember, with red blood cells, they have a pretty distinct life cycle. Usually it's around 120 days. White blood cells, on the other hand, they usually can live for several months or years, but most of them only live for a few days. Lymphocytes are going to be the main cell that can live for a lot longer, whereas most other white blood cells are going to live for a much shorter time. Now, the main function of white blood cells is to combat invading microbes. So that's what they're mostly going to do. Now, during a period of infection, phagocytic white blood cells might only live for a few hours. So they're going to phagocytize everything that they need to, and then they're going to die off and get replaced by other white blood cells. One other really cool distinction between red blood cells and white blood cells is that white or red blood cells, they're confined to the bloodstream. They can't really leave the blood vessels. They have to stay within them. But white blood cells are so different. They can actually leave the bloodstream, and this is a process called emigration or diapedesis. This is where white blood cells are actually going to leave the bloodstream and go into surrounding tissues in order to combat those microbes that are going to be in the surrounding tissue around blood vessels. So they need to go and actually travel to the area where they're needed to fight. So here we have the actual diapedesis, what we're actually going to see when those white blood cells are going to leave the bloodstream. So here we have a neutrophil cell, and they have these cool little proteins on the cellular membrane. These are called integrins. So these are going to be these little green ones that are represented here. They're called integrins. And along the blood vessel are going to be other proteins that are called selectins. So we see these selectins here. And we're actually going to have these white blood cells. They're going to kind of roll along the endothelium. And the selectins and integrins are going to kind of connect to one another, so it sticks so that the cell is going to stick to the endothelium. And then we're going to actually squeeze through between those endothelial cells and leave the bloodstream. Now, the exact signals that stimulate emigration through a vessel are actually going to differ between different types of white blood cells, but these molecules that are actually called adhesion molecules, so the integrins are going to be an adhesion molecule. I'll do a different color here. So these are adhesion molecules that actually help the white blood cells to stick to the endothelium. And so different white blood cells might have different adhesion molecules, whereas these neutrophils are going to have integrins. Other white blood cells will have different molecules. So generally, when we have an increase or elevation in the white blood cell count, this is going to be indicative of infection or inflammation. Now, there is a particular word for this. This is called leukocytosis. And this is generally an increase in the white blood cell count above 10,000 white blood cells per microliter. So 10,000 white blood cells per microliter. Now, this elevation in white blood count, this is normally a very normal protective response to strenuous exercise or to invading microbes. Even to things like anesthesia and surgery are also going to give us this increase in white blood cell count. So it is a very normal process. Now, we also might have a low white blood cell count, and this can be due to several things. It could be due to radiation or shock, or even some like chemotherapy agents. And a low white blood cell count is never beneficial, whereas a high white blood cell count is beneficial. Sometimes it's normal, like in exercise, but a low white blood cell count is never beneficial. So there is a name for a low white blood cell count as well, and it's called leukopenia. And this is usually a white blood cell count below 5,000 white blood cells per microliter of blood. So this is 5,000. And diagnostically, when you go to the doctor and you get your blood drawn, they're going to do a differential white blood cell count to really test and see what your white blood cell count is. So in the next video, we're actually going to look specifically at what each of these white blood cells does. But because they each have a different role, determining the percentage of each type in the blood is really going to help with diagnosing a condition. So when we do a diagnostic white blood cell count, it's actually going to give you the specific numbers of each type of white blood cell. And then you can kind of see on this table what a high count of this particular white blood cell will indicate and what a low count of this particular white blood cell would indicate. So as you can see, they're a little bit different with neutrophils. When we have a high count, this would be indicative of bacterial infection because neutrophils are going to be attacking bacteria. Burns and stress and inflammation are also a couple things that neutrophils are going to combat. Low count is going to indicate a radiation exposure, a vitamin B12 deficiency, just to name a few. Lymphocytes, they're going to be really focusing on viral infections, so attacking viruses that come into the body. And a decrease or a low lymphocytic count would be indicative of a prolonged illness or HIV infection, also immunosuppression. Monocytes, these help with a lot of things, viral or fungal infections, also some other chronic diseases. So these are really important for a lot of things. And so a high monocytic white blood cell count is going to be indicative of many things. A low count, we're going to see things like bone marrow suppression. So quite interesting there. Eosinophils are going to be, well, along with basophils, these two are kind of similar here, but these work together for allergic reactions. And we're also going to see with a low count, we're going to see with eosinophils, this could be indicative of drug toxicity or very acute allergic reactions. Whereas basophils, a low count would be indicative of pregnancy, hypothyroidism, those kinds of things. And that's the end of chapter 19, part 4.